Now, in the last video, we looked at how we can visualize a confidence interval, and we used a sort of a target. We shot some shots at it, we had some bullets, and we said we can, based on this sample that we had here, so we used this as a sample, and we said we have a 95% confidence area where we believe that when we shoot a lot of times, then our impact will be there. Now, this is just a confidence interval for actually shooting at such a target. And there are lots and lots of different ways how we can construct and generate such a confidence interval or confidence area, depending on the problem, depending on the number format that we have. The principle, however, is always the same. It's always, we start with a sample. So we have a sample here, and from this sample, we then, through some mathematical procedures, we will generate a confidence interval, and because I'm very lazy, I abbreviate that with CI. So that stands for confidence interval. We can generate this confidence interval and say, okay, we are certain percent certain that 95% of our data, when we measure them very often, will be within this confidence interval. So let me give you an example. So, for example, I want to look at, oh yes, this is a nice one. I've got 20 phone calls. 20 phone calls in one day. So that's my sample that I look at, and now I want to generate a confidence interval because I want to know how often I would usually have to answer the phone. So I generate a confidence interval, and I say on, say, 95 out of 100 days, I would expect to have a certain amount of phone calls. Will it be exactly 20 every day? Probably not. There will be some variation. Some days I will get less, some days I might get more. But from this sample, I'm trying to figure out how many phone calls per day I would usually get. And this here is what we call count data. So we count the number of phone calls, count data, and this is usually within a time period or space, something like that. And we would use a particular equation that we will discuss later on, and we will find that we would, for 95% of the time, we will find that there will be between 12 and 31 phone calls per day. So that would be my confidence interval. And if I look at 100 days, 95 of them, there will be between 12 and 31 phone calls. And we will discuss how we can actually calculate that. Here is another example. Let's say I do coin flips, and I find that I have, let's say, what do we do? We go for 45 out of 100 times I get tails. So I flip my coin 100 times, and I get 45 tails and obviously 55 heads I would get out of 100. Now here we have, again, we have a sample. That is our sample. And from this sample, I generate my confidence interval. And I want to know what happens, how often would I get tails if I flip the coin loads and loads of times, more than 100 times. Here, actually, we don't have count data. It's not within a time or within space. It is 45 within a certain amount of trials. And here we would have proportion data, or sometimes also called ratio data, because it is a proportion out of 100, 45 out of 100. And when we do this calculation, we will find that 95% confidence interval would be somewhere between 35.6% and 54.8% of the times I would get tails. That is when I do it very, very often. So from my sample, I make a sort of an inference. I try to figure out how much would I get in the long run if I did that for a long, long time. And last but not least, I might have some measurements where I measure, for example, I don't know, ATP levels in a cell, and I get various measurements. Let's say I get say 9 measurements or something like that. And here again I would take this 9 measurements. I would use this as a sample. So that's my sample here. And again, I would use the data to generate a confidence interval. Generate the confidence interval where I say, instead of 9 times, if I do these measurements, if I repeat them loads and loads and loads of times, I want to know where these data usually would be, where 95% of these data would sit if I repeated them very, very often. And here our data are actually continuous data. And again, they have a different way of calculating the 95% confidence interval. And we will go into detail how we do that for continuous data. We will also look at the count data. So we will do count data, we will look at proportion data, and we will look at continuous data. The important thing is that all these different data formats have their own way of calculating the 95% confidence interval. We don't have to restrict ourselves to 95%. We can do 99% or 50% or something like that, but 95%, that is really the common one. But all these data formats have different ways how to calculate these 95% confidence interval, where we say we are pretty sure that 95% of our measurements in the long run will be located within this interval, or within this area if we look at the target site. So I hope this makes sense, and thank you very much for watching.